when I think Bruce Janowsky, I think of an early conversation I had with you where you, in fact, took a plane ride with one Steve Cass to catch up with a guy named Michel Thomas. Mm-hmm. And now, having revisited on Wikipedia here this morning, tell me how you connected with Michel Thomas and what you learned from that whole process. I mean, it's a great story.
So Michel Thomas wrote a book called Test of Courage. Is it in the Wikipedia?
Mm-hmm.
Test of Courage?
Something like that, yeah.
And it was about his experiences in World War II. It was an autobiography. And it was also about some of his experiences after the war. And this would have been 20 years ago because I was just a board member at the Jackson Center, and it kind of barely existed. But I read the book, and I called the publisher, and I said, I'm a board member of the Robert H. Jackson Center, and I want to interview Michel Thomas. And I left the message with the publisher, and this is back when people would answer your phone calls, and I got a call back a day later from London, and it was Michel Thomas.
Wow.
And the reason he returned my phone call is because I told him I was on the board of the Jackson Center, mm-hmm. which I thought was pretty interesting. He had been raised in grew up in Poland. Do you want me to tell the story?
Sure, absolutely, please.
Fascinating story. He grew up in Poland, and his early childhood was fundamentally a lesson in anti-Semitism, from soup to nuts. What he later told me is that, he actually wrote about this in his book, that Poland was very anti-Semitic. Somebody had thrown his mother down a well because she was Jewish, or at least he interpreted it that way. And shortly after that, he left Poland because of that environment. And he went to Austria, where he said it was like a breath of fresh air. There was so much less anti-Semitism in Austria. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
And then I believe it's called the Anschluss, where the Germans went into Austria. Hitler went into Austria. It was a peaceful takeover, but it was a military takeover. So he fled and went to France, where he said it was the most anti-Semitic country in the world. Never knew that. Did you know that?
Mm-mm.
That was his opinion. And he ended up in the French resistance when the Germans invaded. And he fled to Lyon, France. So there was Free France, which didn't exist because it had been taken over by the Germans. And there was Vichy France, that was the French government that was sympathetic with the Nazis. So the Free French were in exile. De Gaulle was in London, and the Vichy French were in Lyon and that part of France. I think Lyon down to part of the Mediterranean. And he ended up in Lyon, and the first day, you've heard of Klaus Barbie,
mm-hmm.
and he was at, I don't know if he was SS, but he was a police, I'm sure he was probably SS. His first day in Lyon, he got assigned to Lyon, France. His first day, he arrested Michel Thomas. His very first day. And he only by chance ran into him, like coming around the corner in a building. They literally bumped into each other. And so, which began for Michel Thomas a series of 3 different concentration camps that he was in. and he escaped from 3 different concentration camps and lived to tell about it. And those stories are really fascinating. And I've read a lot of books about World War II, and I've read a lot of books about the Holocaust, and Anne Frank's diary, and Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, and some more morbid ones about the Dr. Mengele. I mean, they're terrible. And the reoccurring theme has been, for me, when I read them, is how can people do that? How can people do that to each other? So this is the first time I actually ever got to talk to a Holocaust survivor. So Steve went with me, because he'll do almost anything crazy. He read the book and he went with me, and we flew out to New York and interviewed Michelle Thomas in a restaurant, and not far from the World Trade Center, which had just been collapsed, bombed. And he had a lot to say about Saddam Hussein being a animal. He made a lot of comparisons between him and Hitler. But I finally got to ask the question I never got to ask. Am I supposed to look at you or the camera?
You look at me.
Okay. I never got to ask anybody before, which was, how could people do that to each other? I mean, when you were in this concentration camp, one of 3, didn't you say to yourself, how could human beings do this to each other? And what he said, I'll never forget, and it's rocked me, it still rocks me to this day. He said, no, never once. I said, never once? You said, how could people do this to each other? He said, nope, never once. I'm like, and I don't know if my jaw fell off my face and my food came out or what. I didn't know what to say. Like, I didn't even know where to go after that. And he said, Bruce, do you remember when I called you, or back when I called you from London? He said, I was in the Mayfair Hotel when I called you. And do you remember the question I asked you, the first question? I said, yeah, I think you asked me if I was Jewish. He said, yeah, I did. And when you said no, that took me back to 1935, and then throwing my mother down the well. And if you were Polish, which Janowsky is, and you weren't Jewish, it meant you were one of them. And he said, I had to talk myself down from hating you. Because we were taught to hate. They were taught to hate us, and we were taught to hate them. And I had to say to myself, this is a young man, I was at the time, this is a young man that's trying to learn. It's not who you're mad at. And I had to talk myself down. Do you remember that? I said, I just thought maybe you hung up on me or that we got a bad connection. He said, no, I had to talk myself down. He said, when you are taught to hate, the concentration camp makes perfect sense to you. And I've thought about that a lot since then. And I think about the Israelis and the Palestinians, and how if you're taught to hate, and to us, the fighting there doesn't make sense. Does it make sense to you? It seems so devastating and wasteful and dehumanizing. But if I go by Michelle Thomas's lesson, to them it makes perfect sense. And you know, the Irish Republican Army, and I remember one time I was in New York, I went to a bar in Manhattan called the, it's still there, McSorley's Irish Pub. It's still there, they have a phone, you can call it. And they had an Irish Republican, it was St. Patrick's Day weekend. They had an Irish Republican Army fundraiser, which I didn't know. We went there, and you damn right I gave him $50. You better. So that was 1981 or 82, 83. It made a lot the same thing. Generational warfare. It's taught from generation to generation. And a good example of that is of trying to get out of that loop is in Buffalo. I don't know if they still do it, but during that period of time, they were inviting kids from Ireland and Northern Ireland, the Protestant part and the Catholic part, to Buffalo for the summer to play soccer. Did you know about this program? And they would place, in these summer soccer leagues, they would place the kids with various people's houses. And the first thing the kids would want to know when they got alone with their roommate, the guy that lived in Buffalo or East Aurora or wherever it was everybody on their team and who was Catholic and who was Protestant. And the kids would say, I don't know. Why do you got to know? Well, you don't know? No, I don't know. Why do you have to know? I just got to know. Well, why? So a process like that can decouple you from that.
Yep.
A different environment, you know? It can be unlearned, right? But maybe programs like that are why they're not at war anymore there. It's not easy relationship, but it's not like it used to be. So Steve and I flew out to talk to him, and he told us about his book, and I think Michelle Thomas was quite the ladies' man. And at the time we interviewed him, he was 85, and his daughter from his first marriage was just going away to college. He left a trail of tears from Poland through France to the United States. A really interesting guy.
Did you stay in touch afterwards?
So in his book also is he is one of the guys that helped arrest Keith Piper. Keith Piper was the SS tank commander that was accused of machine gunning down all 180, 150 troops at Malmedy during the Battle of the Bulge. And and so Michelle Thomas was a rascal. So the summer, end of April was VE Day, somewhere around there. And that summer, they were scouring Germany for war criminals, especially for SS officers, for the Nuremberg Trials, for a lot of different reasons. Probably we were fighting with the Russians to find out who could get the most rocket scientists, those kind of, but Keith Piper was somebody they hadn't been able to find. And Michelle Thomas was working with the intelligence units. He could speak, I think, 8 languages, and he was just very streetwise. So he said, give me, I can't remember the dollar amount, I'll say $40,000, and I will get more war criminals than you will ever even realize. I need $40,000, and they gave it to him. I'm sure he probably told them their plan. He hired a circus, and a circus going through war toward Germany is a big deal. Even today with COVID, it would be a big deal, right? Yeah. Go to the circus, and he had the word get out that, I can't remember who it was now. Let's call him Bozo the Clown, was actually organizing a readout for the SS in Austria. But don't tell anybody. But he's actually recruiting, but don't tell anybody, it's a secret. And so the circus would go from town to town to town, and word went out that Bozo the Clown is this secret SS guy. He's forming a readout. And so these SS officers came out of the woodwork, and they would meet Bozo the Clown, give them their names. He would tell them when they were going to meet, and they all met that fall, I don't know what month, at this place, and that was their scheduled meeting for their readout, their first meeting, and all these SS guys came in, and Michelle Thomas was at the front of the room. He was Bozo the Clown. And the military police came in and arrested them all. Klaus Barbie was one of them,
No,
according to Michelle Thomas's book.
that's fantastic. Well, you must have been awed by the whole thing.
Yeah, it was
This
pretty...
is a touch of history.
Well, it was pretty interesting because in the context of the World Trade Center blowing up, or being bombed, there were a lot of other things going on that were pretty tense, and we talked about those a little. We talked about those quite a bit too. But his war exploits are in his book, and I'm paraphrasing them, and I'm not going to vouch for their 100% accuracy because it's been 20 years since I read the book. But pretty interesting guy, and when you think about it, when we were growing up, there were people in our neighborhoods, the Don Haglunds and the Fred Johansons, and was your dad in World War II?
Mm-hmm.
What did he do?
Maybe.
Okay. These people were our neighbors.
Yeah.
And Michelle Thomas's story is fascinating, but best to put your life on the line and get shot at is pretty fascinating. These people, I watched that movie about, is it Unbroken?
Yeah.
Okay, and the main character in it grew up in Warren, Pennsylvania, and then moved to New Jersey, and that's where most of the story starts. But Louis,
We tried to get him here. Remember that?
Yeah.
Actually, Salamanca, but yeah, we tried to get him there.
I went to the movie with my kids, and the movie ended. I started crying. My kids were like, "Why are you crying?" Like, I knew people like that. Like, those were people I grew up with, and they had a tremendous influence on me. Not even necessarily understanding it because they were veterans, but because they were men. They were men like that. Like, those are the people we grew up around. I mean, it's pretty amazing when you think about it.
No question.
They were our role models. There were some rough edges to them, but there were some very valiant edges to them too.
And everybody had a story. So we started the Jackson Center in really December of 2000.
Okay.
Shortly thereafter, Carl Kappa, Betty Linnae, myself sort of decided we'd create the center and created a board. And very early on, a guy named Bruce Janowsky joined us. Do you remember how that happened? Did somebody give you a call?
Yeah, Greg Peterson called me, and I remember my response is, Greg, I'm interested in World War II, but I don't really know anything about the law or Jackson or the Supreme Court, so I don't know if I'm the right guy.
Well, you were. Your name came up, I obviously knew you, but through really Raleigh. Raleigh suggested that Bruce would be a good guy, because Raleigh was on the board at the time.
Oh, yeah.
He was not the executive.
He was involved with the Battle Monuments Commission then, yeah.
And then that sort of started the early involvement of the Jackson Center. We were meeting probably at the center, and one of the things we were talking about today was we'd have a table, which was just really a card table. Didn't even have what we now know as the boardroom. Do you remember that some of the other board members, there weren't that many?
I remember Janet Carlson,
Right.
and probably of all the board members that I've known now or since, she's probably worked as hard as anybody. I think John Barrett works pretty hard. Like, it's hard to research and write articles. But Janet was doing the books every month, and very conscientious, very interested in the Jackson Center, and huge contribution, because it's not really a fun job. not necessarily easy job. And I think the accounting around a foundation is a lot different than around a small business. You know, there are a lot of hoops you have to go through to keep your 501c3 3C status, and she figured out all that stuff on her own. You know, did it. I thought she did a great job. And Raleigh and I believe Dan Bratton was on the board, wasn't he? Early?
Dan was our early executive.
But wasn't he on the board for a while too?
Yeah.
No, he was on the, okay.
He was our executive director, and then had pancreatic cancer, and then passed away
Yeah.
fairly early.
And he was great because I went to Russia with him.
Did you?
Yeah, and I just thought he was a really wonderful guy, and a can-do, and it's possible. You know, let's talk about, if it's raining, let's talk about how we're going to build an ark. That was Dan Bratton. And I thought, like when he put that Russia trip together, it was remarkable, really, what he did. And when I got to go on the trip as an American citizen, and to think that this guy that I know in Jamestown, New York, and Chautauqua put this together, and who the hell are we? And so that was really a fun, interesting learn, and I gained a lot of respect for Dan, because that was not an easy, it's probably way more than he thought he was in for. It was pretty remarkable experience. Did you ever go on any of those trips?
Did not. Was the beneficiary when they came here.
Right.
The first time, and one of the first guests we took my daughter there was Tereshkova. Tereshkova was an ambassador from Russia, and of course was the first female cosmonaut.
Okay.
And so to have my daughter meet her
Right.
at Bester Plaza, get her autograph, picture, she lit up. Not my daughter, but she lit up that somebody would either recognize her. I go, "You kidding me? You're Tereshkova."
Yeah.
So that was, spent some time there.
I believe that is the cosmonaut that joined us. There was a cosmonaut, I believe it was Tereshkova. I have my picture taken with him,
Yeah.
and I tried to steal his hat. And I was in the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. We were doing a reception, and he was there. And in the coat room, when I was leaving, was this beautiful Cosmonauts hat that I started to put in my bag because I thought this would be a great souvenir. And guess who walked into the coat room? The cosmonaut.
Yeah.
And I saw him a couple days later at an event, and he was nick at me, but kind of laughing. And then I asked him if he would get his picture taken with me. He said, sure. I think he thought it was funny, but scared me a little bit.
There you go.
But back then, there were great souvenirs, you know?
Yeah, it'd be an international incident.
I know that the feeling I had in Russia at the time was really, there were a lot of feelings. One of them was, at the time, so this would have been 87 or 88, the Soviet Union was our generations long enemy. The evil empire, literally, they have been labeled that, the evil empire. And there were certainly a lot of things to be concerned about. And it wasn't invalid in terms of Marxism and its impact on people. But going there and knowing how much of a threat they were advertised as, by who in our government or who in I'm not sure who was behind that. But then going there and you'd see things like none of the cars in Moscow at night drove with their lights on because they couldn't get replacement light bulbs. They had some of the hotels that were supposed to be tourist hotels would have escalators because Western hotels had escalators, but they didn't work. Our hotel had a Baskin Robbins on the street, but it didn't have any ice cream. It just had posters of ice cream. Nothing worked. You push a button, nothing worked. So this whole country, where you get a mile outside of Tbilisi, Georgia, and everyone's moving around in wagons. People are flying. They're buying airline tickets on. What's a Russian airline? It was the only airline that. What's the name of the Russian airline? There's a state airline. They're buying airline tickets to go from Tbilisi to Moscow to take their chickens and goats and fruit and vegetables to sell them there because they could get enough money to sustain themselves in Tbilisi, Georgia, that there was no transportation system set up. They were just buying a seat on an airline, and the airline smelled like goat piss, So these people are advertised as our mortal enemies, and they were going to destroy us. There was no freaking way. They could barely nothing worked there. So it kind of has made me a little suspicious of everything since then, which is, if they were our mortal enemies and they were close to taking us over, and that ended up not being true. And I read the book. C. Hedrick Smith, the author, wrote a book on the Russians. He was with us. Were we oversold on their might?
Yeah. You had a chance being on the board and seeing upfront and personal kind of the board membership and really growing from nothing. I mean, we had an endowment, fortunately, from Betty Linnae and Carl Kappa and the Gebbe Foundation, and tried to match up programming to sort of bring Jackson, the personality, alive.
I think Carl donated, his first donation was for $400,000, and it was amazing. Like, we were bowled over. It was really a generous contribution, and probably without it, we wouldn't be here. And then Betty Linnae came in, who the equally generous, I don't remember the exact amount, but I just remember Carl's. At the time, I remember thinking, holy cow, he donated $400,000. I was bowled over by it.
Betty matched that shortly thereafter for $500,000.
Yeah.
And then Gebbe Foundation gave us another $500,000.
Right.
So our balance sheet in about June of that year was about $1.5 million in revenue and no expenses. It was a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
It's just gone downhill since then.
And I don't think we spent a lot of money for the building, right?
No, $122,000.
Yeah. Well, since then, maybe we spent some money.
I would think so. It was you and Raleigh, Randy Sweeney, Jeanette Carlson.
Yeah, Randy.
Randy. It was really cool.
Raleigh.
About 7 people.
Yeah.
That really, Willard Cass.
Yeah.
That sort of drove that bus for quite a period of time.
And Raleigh was he was the kind of guy, like, when I went to a board, he's the guy I wanted to sit next to, because I could always talk to him about some World War II thing, because he wrote a book about World War II, and I always found him a really interesting guy and a genial adversary when we disagreed about stuff. Really, the kind of guy you wanted in the room. That was Raleigh.
And really connected politically with a small p to the power structures, whether it was the Bill Parments and or the Pat McGee and later Kathy Youngs.
Yeah.
And they were very supportive, and Raleigh had their ear. And it was, but again, it was coupled by a good diversity of board members. And as from a programmatic perspective, do you recall in kind of fairly early days, we brought in some interesting people, one or two that you sat there in the audience and said, my God, am I impressed?
Well, I think when Sandra Day O'Connor came, That was pretty cool. When Rehnquist came, that was, although he scared the shit out of me. Like, if you did one thing wrong, he was going to bark at you, right?
Yes.
And that was impressive, and it was also awe-inspiring because you realize that this is a legacy we're kind of in charge of that is really bigger than us. Like if you have a Rehnquist come or a Sandra Day O'Connor come, I think she came twice, didn't she? It was kind of this feeling like, holy cow, this is really bigger than I thought. I remember that feeling from it. I remember a lunch we went to with an attorney from West Virginia who wrote a book about the Nuremberg Trials, and he interviewed, you will remember his name, he interviewed I think 9 or 10 of the first 13 convicted at Nuremberg. Do I have that approximately?
Ken Heckler?
Yes. And that was fascinating. And I remember, and you know, times have changed a little bit. I wish they were like they used to be, because it was clear from the time I sat down that politically we agreed with nothing. But it really, that stuff would interfere with a normal discussion today. But it really had nothing to do with what we were talking about. Yeah. And it didn't really matter to me. I don't think it really mattered to him. Right. It was a difference in opinion or direction. So I think back to some of those discussions now and think it was a healthier environment, maybe. I think we'll get back to that, but I remember asking him a question. So he interviewed
Goering?
Yeah, Goering. He interviewed like 9 of the, was it von Rundstedt, or Paulus, von Paulus? Seisenkorn?
Keitel?
Yeah.
Jodl?
The Donitz?
Donitz, yep.
Donitz. And they were in a prison somewhere outside of Nuremberg before they were moved to the Nuremberg.
It was in Luxembourg, called the Ash Can.
Okay.
Yeah.
The Ash Can. And it was really interesting. And I remember I said, so these guys, you interviewed him, and he was interviewing him for intelligence. It wasn't just to write a book, but he was interviewing him for intelligence purposes. And I said, so who did you, like of all those guys, I knew at the time I knew who they were. I remembered, I had a list of who they were. I said, who did you like the most? Now, how many times do you get to ask that question, yeah. Right? And he said, you're not going to believe it, but it was Hermann Goering. Now, here's what I perceived as the most pompous, glorified, pain in the ass general that there was. And of course, he was maybe since 1933 when he got injured in the beer hall push, he was addicted to heroin. So maybe this is the first time in many, many years he hadn't been on it because he was in prison. I don't know. But he said, his family would come and visit him, his children, and they adored him. They just adored him. Like, holy cow, I would have never, of all those people, I would have never guessed him. Right. Now, I never did ask him, well, was he like actually a good guy, or was he just the least worst of the worst? I never really got to that point, but I thought that was fascinating.
In fact, most recently, you had a chance to have lunch with Gerhard Weinberg, another guy who was of that time period and a historian.
Right.
And that was fascinating because just had a chance to understand him as a Jewish historian of World War II and how to be dispassionate. I mean, how can you be that way?
Right. Well, and he was involved in the Marshall Plan? Yeah. Was that his specialty, the Marshall Plan?
Specialty, and then he became a
Right.
World War II historian and just did a lot of stuff. And so
Yeah.
we had a chance to see Chief Justice Roberts.
Yeah.
So when you think about, and your point is so well taken, is this is bigger than us, is given the talent, and they all came here for nothing.
Right.
It wasn't because you or I asked them.
Right.
It was because of Jackson.
Well, just like the first interview I got when I told somebody, he said the reason he called me back is because of he knew Robert Jackson. He was very curious about the Jackson Center, which I said, well, we have 3 chairs and a table right now. But thanks for calling me back.
And that was just about it. Did you
Yeah.
get a chance to ever go to Washington, D.C.? Were you part of any of those trips?
No,
No.
I was not.
Yeah.
I went to New York one time, and I think we gave an award to somebody that was involved with Red Apple refineries, or do you remember that?
Was Barrett Prettyman at that event? I know Barrett flew in for a couple events. Did we meet at Judge Kay's office? We had a board meeting probably in Washington.
And we were in New York.
Oh,
I remember we walked towards through Central Park or near Central Park, and United Refining. The guy was involved with the United Refining.
Castamatidis.
Yeah.
John Castamatidis.
I think he still would like to give us $3 million.
Castamatidis is running for, announced he might be running for mayor of New York City, and he's willing to throw in some god-awful number, $100 million to the campaign. That was announced yesterday.
Really?
Yeah.
So that's a guy.
Yeah, John Castamatidis. Good friend. Stan knew him well.
Okay.
I don't know how that all connected,
Right.
but they're think of a different political
Right.
persuasion, but they somehow knew each other.
Yeah. And and Stan Lundeen, when he was a congressman, one of my good friends, Greg Edwards, was an intern with him. And I can remember some nights at the Fido House, him talking about his internship. And I believe Ronald Reagan was the president then, and the struggle via Greg Edwards that Stan Lundeen was going through was, my constituents want this legislation, but I don't agree with it. And what do I do? And I just thought that was a great reflection on Stan Lundeen, and it still is today, because I'm not sure most people would even wrestle with that today.
Right.
I don't ever know what his answer was, but the fact that he was wrestling so hard with that and openly, I thought was a credit to him.
Right.
You know, and I think Stan would come back when he was lieutenant governor, and he would come back and sometimes talk in Jamestown, and I was a young businessman, and Mario Cuomo was maybe my least favorite person. And Stan, of course, and I would just blast Stan. I would just blast him. And, he was always a gentleman to me. And I look back on it now and go, oh my God, I can't believe I did that. So, I think Stan's a gentleman, and when he doesn't have to be. He was to me when I was young, and my passion was greater than my common sense. So, of course, I blasted Amo Houghton too. But Stan was always a gentleman in that regard, which is pretty awesome attribute. And Stan was involved with our board for probably 10 years, at least.
And he's still on it and probably going to roll off as
Yeah.
I will be here soon. Yeah, I was thinking about that the other day, Bruce. You were on the board and will be on the board, except me, longer than anybody.
Yeah, could be.
That's a badge of honor.
Well,
And then, by the way, Jen Champ was talking about you and how you inspired her on a couple of exhibits there at the center, one being the Nuremberg cell block one.
oh yeah. Yeah, I have these. When I was a kid, I guess maybe a teenager, one of my father's friends was a prison guard in Nuremberg. And one of the things that, and he was a prison guard there when his name is Lauren Macbeth, nice guy. But he was a guard there when the first 13? Were in prison, and they would write notes to the guards for requests because they weren't convicted yet. They were entitled to certain privileges, like I want to see my attorney, or I need new socks, or I need somebody to repair my socks, or I need sleeping pills, or turn my heat down, like just very fundamental life living things. And they would hand them to the guards, and the guards would take them to the front desk. We're good at anything. Americans are good at bureaucracy. So we had a bureaucracy at the Nuremberg prison for handing the notes off to go to the desk to get to the thing to get whatever, to get the socks back. But these guards weren't allowed to leave because they had to be literally watching the prisoners the whole time. So he must have saved some, or one from each guy, and the only one I don't have from that is Goering. Got Hess. I think probably what's interesting about those notes is that these people were all prisoners at the time they wrote them. They weren't writing dictates and, under their official titles. They were prisoners of war at the time. And for some of them, some of the last things they would write, bring me my sleeping pill.
Notes from the Cell Block was what it was called, and it was a Janowsky special. The other one that Jen Champ talked about was your encouragement of her to do something on World War II and
Right.
Johansson's
Right.
the wedding dress. Talk a little bit about that.
So we did, Jen did it, but she advertised in the Post-Journal for anybody that had World War II artifacts, letters, things of interest from World War II that they had or their relatives had, and people brought them in. A lot of, posters and calendars and pictures and stories. And one of the things, a couple of things that we put in is one of them was Fred Johansson's wife's wedding dress, which I still think we've got to take this to the CIA. It's got to be on display there with the Jackson Center name on it. Has to be. I'll tell you why I think so. So Fred Johansson was born and raised in Jamestown. His father was a Salvation Army minister. I think maybe he originally came from Minneapolis or somewhere. I'm not sure. I don't think he was a native. He volunteered for the military and got on a train and went to basic training. And his mother said that she was sending an angel to watch over him. And he had some pretty amazing exploits during the war. And It must be true. And he said he felt it the whole time. It's fascinating. So he ended up in Colorado learning to become a medic. I guess in the Navy they'd be a corpsman. Like Lou Groza was a corpsman. Remember that?
Really?
That was a fun interview. So Fred is in this camp, and he may not even be a private yet. You have to become a private first class, right? So he is called down to the camp commander's office, and it scared him to death, because he said there's no reason you would get called into the camp commander's office, and unless it was really bad. So he went down and scared to death, and there was a guy there from Washington and said they were looking for Swedish and Norwegian speaking Americans to volunteer for a mission. And Fred said, okay. And I don't know how many days later he's on a train going from Colorado to Washington, D.C. Instructions not to tell anybody about it. And he went to, on the train, he runs into a guy from Jamestown, New York, named Andy Anderson, who was also learning to become a medic. Now, Fred spoke Swedish. Andy Anderson spoke Norwegian. And they sat on the train together, and they weren't allowed to talk about it. But they figured out there was something going on. It had something to do with language. They end up at the Congressional Country Club in Washington, D.C., which had been taken over and made into an OSS training facility. And they were trained in, I guess, special warfare tactics, and which at the time were, I'm sure, the OSS was just starting up. Maybe not that much different than military training. Certainly in Morse code and things like that. And then they went to Scotland and trained on skis. And their job was they were going to jump into Norway and blow up these bridges and keep the Germans from leaving Scandinavia and Norway after D-Day. So I'll go back to the country club. At the country club, Fred meets Elsie Gordon, who is from Jamestown, New York, and she's a typist in the OSS office. Well, Elsie Gordon's from Jamestown, happens to be single, and Fred starts dating her and whatever free time he had, right? And then off he goes to Scotland. And they were trained, all ready to go into Norway, and D-Day came, and they said, you know what? We're going to drop you guys into France. And their commanding officer said, but none of us speak French, we all speak Swedish. Sorry, good luck, goodbye. And off these Swedes and Norwegians went into France and blew up bridges, did all this stuff, and Fred, this is the story of the wedding dress. It really, I can't leave anything out because this is the whole wedding dress story. So Fred goes to the first mission, second mission, I think it was called Percy Red was the name of their group. And they went to blow up this railroad line, this Percy Red group. They had all different kinds. They had the Judbergs that were in France at the time, working with collaborators. and these guys went to blow up a railroad line, and they lined up all along the railroad, and they were very careful instructions. Do not put your head up, do not look, because the Germans carried 88 millimeter cannons on the front of the trains, and their commanding officer, a guy named Anderson, stuck his head up, and it was blown off by an 88, and he was right next to Fred. So they had at which point they blew up the railroad line, and they had a signal they were all supposed to give each other to evacuate, and Fred never got it. He was at the end, so everybody else evacuated, and he was sitting in these bushes at the bottom of this hill waiting for his signal. He never got it, so he stayed there, and then moved because the Germans were coming, and hid somewhere in these bushes. And in the morning, he looks up on a hill by him, and there's a farmhouse on top of the hill, and this guy is walking towards him. And he's all camoed. He's hiding in the bushes. It's taking him an hour to pee because he doesn't want to move and reveal himself. And this farmer is walking right down, almost like he's walking right at him. And the guy stops in front of where Fred is, deeply camouflaged and hidden, and says, "American, American. The Lady Limoges thinks you must be tired and would like to invite you in for tea." So this Lady Limoges, whoever she is, I'm gonna guess they were in the Limoges region of France, invites him up for tea. And they were friends ever since. They corresponded after the war all the time. He gave their kids chocolate because he had chocolate and they had never had it. He had a piece of his parachute, and he made scarves for himself with him and Elsie Gordon's initials on it. And Lady Limoges did the embroidery. And one of the missions, they stole a steamroller and plowed down a wheat field so that they could land at DC-3 at night to get these American pilots out. I mean, this is our neighbors. Can you, just one of those things? And one of the pilots that got out, Fred became friends with and said, "Give this to Elsie Gordon. This is where she is in Washington, D.C." And he said, "Bruce, wouldn't you know it? He delivered the handkerchief, but then he started trying to date my Elsie."
Assuming you'd never come back.
So then they parachute into Norway. They blow up bridges. There are 16 Americans, 48 go in, 16 come out. A couple airplane crashes on the way in, one of them being Andy Anderson. Fred, they found his body, they buried it. There's a picture in National Geographic of Fred and William Colby, who became the CIA director, doing a salute, a gun volley salute over Andy Anderson's body. That really they just piled rocks on top of him because it was in this rocky cliff where they found him. The Germans surrendered. These guys have been chased all over Norway. Basically chewing on speed, amphetamines, to keep themselves going. And the war ended. They're one of 16. There's 16 Americans in occupied Norway, so they had to go accept a German surrender from a field marshal in Trondheim. And they came out of the mountains with 16 guys. And he said it was the scariest mission of his life because all the Germans were armed and they were going to control this whole surrender.
Yeah.
They went out in a boat into the middle of the harbor and accepted the field marshal's surrender. And Fred brought his parachute back, and Elsie made her wedding dress out of it. And the Jackson Center has that now. Elsie's daughter, Debbie, got married in that wedding dress. So I think that wedding dress should be at Langley.
Yeah.
It should be there. That's a great story.
Well, it's a great story. I'm delighted you told it. I know it was written up, but nothing like the real deal.
Yeah. And Fred, when he came back, he had Andy Anderson's ring. He had a signet ring. And his mother did not accept that he was dead. And Fred went to her house and gave her his ring, her son's ring, at which point she accepted it.
Yeah. It's a remarkable story. So many stories like that.
Yeah.
And that's something which has always been a passion of yours, World War II, and how that became such a pivotal part in our history. And of course, the Nuremberg Trial was really the
Right.
bookend of World War
Right.
II.
Right.
And I know you've enjoyed.
And it's really, we have a hard time in our country dealing with grayness. Even the things that we treasure as good they have some dark sides to them.
Mm-hmm.
So the Nuremberg Trials is probably one of the most righteous things that has happened in the history of warfare. But it's got some dark edges to it.
Mm-hmm.
The Russian judges that presided over the trial, several of them went back and became commandants in the concentration camps that were taken over from the Nazis. It's just some it's ironic. And maybe in some ways appalling. At the same time, it was a very good alternative to executing people under passion. It was an attempt to have rule of law. It wasn't perfect, and that's okay. But it was a lot better than whatever we had done previously. So the gray areas of that and of the people involved, pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the Jackson Center will be commemorating its 75th anniversary starting really November 21st. Hard to believe, but that's the opening statement of Jackson, and we'll take a cycle through that whole trial. And in fact, I'll be spending a few minutes after this with Nicole Gustafson there as we have video highlights of just about every day at Nuremberg. So we're gonna roll that all out.
And you went to Auschwitz.
Yes.
That was a march. What was the
March of the Living?
March of the Living, which has become fairly well known recently. And I went to Dachau. I didn't go as part of a ceremony. I just went as a tourist. But going into Dachau is so shocking. I mean, because it's real. It's there. You can feel it. You can taste it. And what was your experience going into Auschwitz? Had you ever been in a concentration camp before that?
I was in Dachau, but
Okay.
Auschwitz with the Birkenau right next to it.
Right.
And so that you could actually walk from Auschwitz, which was the camp, to the
Right.
concentration area. And it was just thrilling, but also chilling. I shouldn't say thrilling in the sense that you're seeing how man's inhumanity to man, and you can't even wrap your heads around it. But
I can remember it took me weeks to just even get it out of. I couldn't think of anything else.
They had a couple of concentration camp
Yeah.
people at the event, and just to have their war stories as they told them.
Yeah.
I mean, here's the real deal. It was. And today, having interviewed so many people who were Holocaust survivors and so many people who were part of the process, and you still can't figure out what the mindset would be that you can't have a moral compass somehow internalized, say this is somehow wrong. You know, they took it out. The moral compass was sucked out of the German people.
Well, there was a group. It's really terrifying. There was a group of German soldiers, and I don't know if this is the right name, Einsatzgruppen? Einsatzgruppen. So they went in behind the Germans in Russia and did a lot of the collecting up, separating of Jews and other nationalities that were, so it wasn't just Jews, there were other, gypsies and other nationalities that were at risk. And these guys were volunteers. They were 40-year-old dentists that left their jobs in Berlin and went and did that. They weren't coerced. They weren't forced. They volunteered. They went and did it. It's really hard to understand and accept that even that we're all capable of homicidal rage. We know that about ourselves. You push somebody to the edge and they will do that. But it's even harder to accept that we could do that unemotionally. And I mean, if they're capable of that, are we capable of that? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we don't have immunity from that. It's kind of really almost, I can't think of a worse horror story to go down. One that might be true,
It's, because we'll probably even learn more about that whole nature of it all through this 75th anniversary recycle of all of this.
So that's why we're here.
Yeah.
I guess because out of the ashes, some good can come, and maybe this is one of the things. But that's why we're here. I'm not sure that I can do anything to prevent it, but I do think celebrating what's right, what's just, I think celebrating that, it's our own little seed to water. and the voice, it will get bigger. Hopefully as Americans, we've moved past that kind of barbaric behavior. And as a world, hopefully we have. A lot of parts of the world have. But still you wonder today, some places, so as long as we're still worried about it, there's a place for the Jackson Center, really.
I agree.
Yeah.
It may always be. Is there a question I should be asking you, Bruce, that you're making notes and thinking about coming in today I wonder if Greg's going to ask me this. Yeah. So the Jackson Center is, I'll just say something. The question would be, what should I know about the Jackson Center that I don't? And maybe you don't even know about it. I'm sure you know about it. At least you have a sense of it. But the Jackson Center, we've had William Rehnquist speak, Sandra Day O'Connor. We've had, help me, some of the Roberts,
John Roberts, maybe Neil Gorsuch, Nuremberg prosecutors. We've had a lot of legal celebrities.
Attorney generals, solicitor generals, we've had it all.
Now, they're only legal celebrities. They're not like corrugated celebrities. They're not that big a deal. But we have had probably as distinguished of a list as you can think of, in terms of international criminal justice. And David Crane, I mean, he's a current day prosecutor, Jim Johnson. People have really helped us and put their shoulder to the wheel, and the people have come to just speak and support us and wish us well. And I can't say any of them necessarily are able to articulate or even know what the Jackson Center means. What should it be doing? What is it? They just know it should. That's a sense I get from it. That there's something about his legacy, or maybe the world's sense of justice, wanting justice, that people hunger for, and that's why they come. And it's not because we have a secret formula, because we don't. But what I think is really what people ought to know about the Jackson Center that they may not know is that they know, I think most people know, it wouldn't exist without Greg. Because really, if anybody's read the book The Tipping Point, you've read it. You're one of the characters in that book. I think you know that. The Jackson Center wouldn't exist without you. But the Jackson Center is really kind of sustained by pretty normal people. Just normal guys. Like I make corrugated boxes. I'm a normal guy that believe in some bigger stuff. And I don't believe in bigger stuff every day, but it's really from the heroes to the normal guys. We all share that yearning for justice. It really is a kind of a cool thing. People that aren't going to benefit by being on the board, that do it because there's a higher purpose in some way. You know? Never thought I'd say that about lawyers.
You'll get through this. There's medicine for that. Now, I think David Crane kind of capsulized it once, and he said, you know, if nothing else, the rule of law is greater than the rule of force. If that's as aspirational as it can get.
Well, you know, there is, like, I know, so this is 2020, and I don't know when people are going to listen to this tape, maybe never, but let's say it's 2030, and for us in 2020, these are very unsettling times. We have political divide, like as bad as I've ever seen it in my life. We have left hates right, right hates left, name calling this and that, and it's, I think, demoralizing for many of us because we treasure the idea of exchanging ideas and good ideas winning, and it seems we're delving into name calling, etc., etc. So as ugly as that is, that's politics. And I'm not saying we should accept it or not, but I think sometimes we forget that politics is really the alternative to war. So as ugly as this is, the alternative is war. So, and justice isn't smooth and it isn't perfect, but what's the alternative? You know, what is the alternative? The alternative is really scary. Vengeance.
It's a good thing the Tarp Skunks will be with us next year. That's the good thing. Jamestown Tarp
Skunks. And the Browns, by the time you listen to this, everybody, the Browns will have won 3 or 4 more Super Bowls.
Thank you. This has been fabulous, Bruce. Thank you.